So for our final class notes document, I want to provide some more cultural and historic context for our final two works of fiction. So by way of that, I want to really focus on sort of three main concepts. One is postmodernism, one is globalization, and one is the idea of what is contemporary British fiction. So our relationship to contemporary British literature, as citizens of the 21st century, we are closest in time to this final period of British literature that we're studying this semester. And so in many ways, the historical and cultural context that we need to understand the course's final readings will feel most familiar to us. One of the real trends of the course has been, as we've gotten closer and closer to our own time period, we have finally now, with this last week, gotten to that point where we're basically dealing with contemporary literature. Even though the two stories this week are from the end of the 20th century, they're basically still set within a world that we know, that we're very familiar with. So one of the big questions that we'll be asking of the works of fiction that we're reading this week is a question not just about British fiction, but about the preoccupying question of much contemporary fiction. So we'll use this also sort of as an opportunity to think about some bigger questions that aren't only specific to British literature, but that blossom out from our reading of British literature. So as Michel Foucault, a hugely influential French philosopher, once put it, maybe the most certain of all philosophical problems is the problem of the present time of what we are in this very moment. So with that in mind, I want to talk now about globalization and England. So the most multifaceted and powerful changes that British society has undergone since the end of the empire is what we can call intensified globalization. So this has been really the biggest change we've seen since the end of the British Empire. Globalization is a complex, contradictory, and controversial process that, in essence, refers to the fact that the Earth's peoples are increasingly connected, their choices intertwined, their economic lives interdependent, their environment all part of one system. There are many theories of what globalization is exactly, how it works, whether it really is what people think it is, and what its positive and negative consequences might be. Most people today take for granted that the world has become globalized, but what that means is certainly up for rigorous debate. In terms of the literary text that we're discussing, Zadie Smith tries to represent what this new globalized reality feels like in lived experience, and how that impacts the lives of the many people who live between or within many cultural traditions. So we'll talk about that, especially I think in terms of The Waiter's Wife, and how in that story Smith is representing and approaching the new realities that you really can't simply isolate any one culture. You can't simply isolate any one national heritage and say, well, this is British literary traditions, and here's who's in it, and here's who's not. It's such an interconnected world because of the process of globalization that we can't neatly separate out these things anymore. And we'll see Smith explore some of that in her story. So along with that is the idea of postmodern culture. So related to the exponentially intensified process of globalization is the rise of what we can call postmodern culture. So sometime during the decades following World War II, new kinds of cultural formations, technologies, and ideas emerged. Many scholars identify the 1960s as the period when postmodern culture really started to emerge in full force. And these technologies, formations, ideas radically transformed the fabric of life, especially in the Western world, including England. So the most notable features of this major cultural shift include globalization, the rise of mass and electronic media, including radio, the cinema, television, and the internet, digital versus analog technologies, so a cell phone instead of a rotary dial phone, or a digital clock where the mechanism of timekeeping isn't self-evident, versus an analog clock that has working gears which can be seen as having a mechanical and self-evident relationship with the working of the clock face. Simulation and simulacra, or the ability to create artificial versions of natural world objects so that the difference between what is real and artificial becomes effectively meaningless and indistinguishable, is another key feature of postmodern culture. Fragmented society and identity, whereby even as the world seems to become more connected through globalization, people and communities feel more and more internally segmented, divided within themselves. And even though in Enduring Love, which is the other work of fiction that we're reading this week, Ian McEwan doesn't really talk at length about technology per se, I do think that we witness in that story some of what we're talking about here in terms of this fragmentation of postmodern culture and identity and the impact of scientific thinking on the way that these characters behave and what they think about. And we'll really see that in that story. Finally, the loss of historical awareness correlated to the onrush of the speed and intensity of the mass-mediated contemporary present, which seems to obliterate or flatten out all historical change into a single unrelenting moment of nowness. So think of the internet, for example, as a medium that incorporates and decontextualizes all knowledge. Other features of postmodern culture include consumerism and global capitalism. So for many theorists of contemporary culture, this is the defining feature of our present condition that shapes almost everything else on this list. Other new technologies that fundamentally alter our relationship to space, to time, and to our bodies. So think of advancements in airplanes or the ability to live in the virtual realities of gaming space, or new medical advancements ranging from our ability to manipulate life on the molecular level to our ability to recreate synthetic human organs and body parts. Increasing urbanization and the loss of the rural, which has been seen to be an especially poignant concern in Great Britain. It's something that we've talked about all semester long. Destabilized frameworks for understanding the world and for being in the world, resulting from all of the above aspects of postmodernity. And yet, in spite of all this radical change, the persistence of people's desire for fixed identities, cultural roots, national origins, sources of meaning, and valued traditions. And again, I think this is a major theme that we'll see in both stories this week. So postmodernism and British literature. Although what exactly postmodernism is and what it does are questions still debated, and although there are many critics who believe that whatever postmodernism is, we are, as of some time within the last 20 years, living after postmodernism, there are a number of concerns, ideas, styles, continuities, and aesthetic strategies that loosely connect the works of British literature published in the second half of the 20th century. And now, again, we're jumping from Virginia Woolf up to these two contemporary writers this week. But I think Ian McEwan and Zadie Smith really stand in for some of the major trends and changes that we've seen in British literature since modernism. So obviously the post in postmodernism suggests that this description of certain kinds of literary and artistic principles and maneuvers has some relationship with modernism, and that's something we can talk about this week on discussion board. The writers most associated with modernism, like Joseph Conrad, Virginia Woolf, and James Joyce, still loom large as major influences, to be rejected, perhaps embraced, modified, teased, questioned. But it is up for discussion as to whether that post suggests a conscious attempt to move beyond modernism, to extend modernism, or to do something else altogether. Thus, just as how modernism was both a response to the previous generation of Victorian writers, and that's something we saw in the last few weeks, and to the conditions of the contemporary world, postmodernism is also a response to the previous generation of modernist and other writers, and to the conditions of the world these writers live in. So contemporary British literature, from basically 1974 onward, many writers reject the label of postmodernism, or question its value, but for our work, it is at least a productive starting point. Unlike with modernism, where there was often a more self-conscious and somewhat communal approach to reinvigorating literature, for example, Virginia Woolf was part of the Bloomsbury group, and so the people who were involved in that circle were sort of creating a sense of community. And you saw that also with some of the modernist manifestos and these statements that were being written that really said, look, here's our new philosophy of art, of literature, and here are the people that are going to adhere to it and practice it. So you had more of that sense in modernism. A hallmark of British literature over the past 35 to 40 years, however, has been a wider array of literary styles, an embrace of popular genres and media forms by some writers, an increase in the kinds of writers finding their way to publication, if not popularity, and a much richer range of aesthetic approaches. You see our reading from Norton about contemporary poetry and fiction for more on this, from the section on the 20th century. So the texts that we're reading attest to the continued vigor of British literature and expansiveness of what we mean when we talk about British literature. All of these writers are part of the evolving tradition of this ever-growing body of literature, and in this week's readings represent the multiplicity of voices speaking with and about this tradition. Zadie Smith, who's pictured to the left, represents this continuing evolution as much as any contemporary writer. So we'll pick up these ideas this week with discussion board, and it's something that I think we'll keep talking about in preparation for the final exam for next week as well.